All right. Well, I am very excited to have Dr. Robinson again here with us, and I have some more objections. Not sure how many we'll get to today, but at least tackle one. And this has been very influential. It has appeared in a number of places, and I want to get Dr. Robinson's reaction because if a layman reads this, he's going to think that this is a devastating argument against the either what's sometimes called the majority text or the Byzantine text. There's some nuance there. We won't tease that out right now. But Dr. Dan Wallace has said in more than one place, and I'm going to quote him exactly here, among extant Greek manuscripts, what is today the majority text did not become a majority until the ninth century. Now, Dr. Robinson, that seems to many to just be the death knell to the majority text or the Byzantine text. How would a Byzantine priorist respond to something like that?
Well, the key word in that whole sentence is the extant, which means the existing Greek manuscripts. And the question is whether or not the number of Greek manuscripts from before the ninth century is actually representative of the actual amount of manuscripts that would have existed if some outside circumstances hadn't occurred to eliminate a large bulk of them. What we do know from the diagram that Wallace gives is that if you take all of the manuscripts prior to the ninth century, it ends up a very small column. And as soon as the ninth century happens, it explodes, it balloons out. Where did all the manuscripts after the ninth century come from? If they hadn't previously existed, then what was the impetus, the motivation to multiply manuscripts so that, for example, in any copy of the Gospels we probably have existing right now around 1600 to 1800 manuscripts, of which probably 90 something percent of them are all Byzantine, and probably we're talking about 97 and 98% of them are Byzantine. The trouble is, if you compare the manuscripts and look at their shared errors and variants, it's hard to determine that very many of them, there's only a few, relatively speaking, that could have been copied one from another. These manuscripts after the ninth century were not copied from one another. They are representing individual lines of transmission, which came from some point prior to the ninth century. What could have been the problem? Well, it is well known, and it was talked about by Reynolds and Wilson, for example, in their book Scribes and Scholars, that at the time of the ninth century, the minuscule script came into being and regular use for literary material, and the uncial basically started to fade out very rapidly. What was going on was manuscripts before the ninth century were being copied into the new minuscule script, and apparently after they were copied, the manuscripts were either destroyed, used for other purposes, or they were rewritten over by some other works, sometimes minuscule manuscript works, or sometimes sermons or other material. And the fact is that this vast mass of manuscripts in the minuscule after the ninth century were apparently copied from uncial exemplars that would have multiplied into the same basically 1600 or so that we now have, because again, you don't have direct copying from one manuscript to another except in a very few cases. So that means the uncial exemplars of most of these 1600 or so manuscripts in the Gospels were in existence before the ninth century. They were then either dismantled, destroyed, reused, or whatever after the 9th century, because the key manuscript from that point on would be the minuscule exemplar. This is not only what Reynolds and Wilson said, it's basically what you had Cursip Blake, R.P. Blake, and Silva New saying back in 1928 with their article on the Caesarean text that was in Harvard Theological Review back then. And they said it was hard to resist the conclusion that scribes systematically destroyed the pre-existing uncial manuscripts once a good minuscule copy had been made. So by stating the objection the way that Wallace did, like I said, the key word is as far as our extant manuscripts show. Wallace is one of the first to suggest that majority text people should not engage in what he called nose counting. And yet that is exactly what he is doing when he raises that objection. He is counting only the existing manuscripts, and he says, because the Byzantine manuscripts in the existing manuscripts of today are not in the majority, therefore the Byzantine text could not have been in the majority prior to the 9th century, and that is a clear logical fallacy, especially when we know that the later manuscripts, not only in the New Testament, but as I said, even among the classical texts, still have their better manuscripts and their most representative ones of what the original text would have been, even in classical literature, from minuscules after the 9th century. Homer, for example, even though Homer was written, 7 or 800 BC, we only have smaller fragments of Homer that are going to date before the 9th century. And in fact, the Homeric scholars say some of the best full manuscripts of Homer are coming from the 13th and 14th centuries. If we applied that same logic to the Byzantine minuscules, we'd be saying that. So again, I think this objection is a fallacy, and it should never have been stated.
Well, and just to be clear, I think he's made a very, and you can correct me on this for sure, but this is my sense with it. I think he's made a carefully calibrated statement that he knows will be read in a certain way. So what he said is technically accurate, but it's a little bit misleading because even Westcott and Hort, they believe that the Byzantine text dominated the first, from the fourth century on. They believe that the Byzantine text dominated. I think every serious textual critic has known that ever since. Am I right on that, or am I mistaken?
Yes, exactly. Westcott and Hort openly admitted that from the 4th century onward, the Byzantine text not only existed but was dominant.
And
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 they admit that. And the way they got around it, they're doing their own fallacy. They applied a hypothetical genealogical argument claiming that all the Byzantine manuscripts derived from a revision that was made in the mid 4th century. And from that point on, it was perpetuated, promulgated with basically official sanction. So that's why the other texts, whether Alexandrian or Western, would have died out or almost died out. So for Westcott and Hort, the only way they could get around what they clearly recognized as a 4th century and later Byzantine dominance was to claim a 4th century recension or revision that created the Byzantine text out of merging Alexandrian and Western readings. If they didn't have that to lean on, if there was no 4th century revision, if you were going to be Westcott and Hort and be honest, you'd go back to what they stated as their own principle, which they said, this was in their introduction on page 45, that a theoretical presumption exists that the original text would be perpetrated. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it would be perpetrated in the majority of extant manuscripts from that point onward. And that, in fact, is what they were claiming. But they said from the autograph onward, it should have been the majority reading at any given point should be the original reading, unless something happened to change that possibility. And that's why they proposed that fourth century revision with official sanction to get rid of the pre fourth century text. With Wallace's position, the only event that occurred in the ninth century was this recopying of uncials into the minuscule script. And that, following the same pattern as Westcott and Hort were pointing out, if the Byzantine text, in fact, per Westcott and Hort, were dominant from the fourth to the ninth century, then after the ninth century, the dominance of the Byzantine text does reflect the recopying of unsealed manuscripts into the minuscule script and the discarding, however it's done, of the previous unsealed exemplars that we no longer have.
And what's interesting to me, and I'm not expert on this, Dr. Robinson, but so you can please correct me, but the majority of textual critics now would probably shy away from a Byzantine recension, which was the Westcott and Hort theory, but nothing's
Right.
really presented itself as a very clear replacement for that view. So it's sort of like Westcott and Hort realized, hey, we need a theory to account for this Byzantine dominance. So they came up with a theory. The theory's been discarded, but there's nothing to replace it. And it's kind of like we've got something like a huge theory kind of floating in the air here without anything to support it anymore. That's almost how, as a layman, that's kind of how it strikes me these days.
This was part of the problem that was objected to by people like Kenneth Clark, or Ernest Caldwell. Caldwell wrote an article called Hort Redivivus, in which he basically said the same thing. We're trying to follow Hort without Hort's basis. Hort's basis was, even though it was wrong, was to create a theory of transmission that would explain the rise and dominance of the Byzantine text. Their theory is wrong because we know now there was no formal revision to create the Byzantine text in the fourth century. But absent that, then it's left with that theoretical presumption that a majority of existing manuscripts at any stage of transmission would reflect a majority of preceding manuscripts as you go all the way back to the autograph. And that's really where we're left today, because modern eclecticism does not have what Westcott and Hort had, which is a theory of transmission. The Byzantine priority position does have a theory of transmission, and our theory is basically very simple. It is Westcott and Hort without their genealogical principle and their Byzantine fourth century revision. Take away those two elements, and the rest of Westcott Hort could fall in and have a nice historical theory that would lead you right to the Byzantine text.
Wow, that's
That's part of
remarkable.
the reason why we named our Greek New Testament, the Robinson Pierpont Greek New Testament, as the New Testament in the original Greek. We took the same title that Westcott and Hort had. The only difference was we stuck after that Byzantine text form.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, Dr. Robinson, you've been very generous with your time. I could talk all day with you about these things. This has been
So
really,
could I.
really enjoyable, really enjoyable. But I know you have things to do and other commitments as well. But we've been so blessed to have you on the channel today, and look forward to talking to you again, hopefully sometime.
Okay, anytime.
All right.